It was the summer of 1972, in a small Memphis diner. Elvis was back home for just a few days. A plate of steaming fried chicken slipped from a waitress's hands and landed right in his lap. Every fork in the room stopped mid-air. If you believe that kindness shows itself in the smallest moments, stay with me, because what Elvis did next turned an ordinary night into a story this waitress told for the rest of her life. The door's glass pane still shook from the summer heat outside when Elvis stepped through. Two men flanked him, both in sport coats, despite the warmth. His sunglasses caught the glow from the neon open sign, and for a moment, every conversation in the room sagged into a whisper. The diner wasn't big. 12 booths, a counter with 8 stalls, and the hum of a jukebox tucked in the corner, playing a slow Sam Cooke tune. The air smelled of frying oil, coffee, and a hint of sweet tea syrup that had dripped onto the floor earlier. Behind the counter, a short-order cook froze mid-flip on a burger. At the register, the owner mouthed something to his wife, eyes wide. A couple at the front booth leaned toward each other, grinning like kids caught passing notes. She saw him before she heard him. The 19-year-old waitress with a frayed green apron. She'd been pouring sweet tea for a pair of truckers when the bell rang. Her stomach tightened. Elvis Presley wasn't just in town, he was in her section. She gripped her notepad, but her palm was slick with sweat. She'd only worked here 3 weeks. Most nights, her biggest worry was whether she'd remembered to top off the ketchup bottles. Now, every step felt heavier, like the tile floor was tilting toward that corner booth. Elvis slid into the red vinyl seat, one arm stretched casually along the backrest. The men with him sat on either side, scanning the room like they were still half on guard duty. Elvis's voice was low when he ordered coffee, Memphis roast, black, and she nodded quickly, eyes fixed on the pen in her hand so she wouldn't have to meet his gaze. From the counter, she heard one of the regulars whisper, "That's him. That's really him." She could feel her heartbeat in her ears as she carried the coffee over, setting it down without spilling a drop. Elvis thanked her, just one word, "Darlin'," but it landed like a warm chord. She smiled back, barely. She turned to leave, thinking she'd survived the first pass. But then Elvis asked for a plate of fried chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread, the works. She scribbled it down, her pen scratching louder than it should have. In the kitchen, she told herself to breathe. She balanced the tray on her forearm, practicing the route back to the booth in her mind. From the dining room, the jukebox clicked to the next record. She heard a few notes of "Can't Help Falling in Love" spill out. She took one last deep breath, stepped out from the kitchen doors, and realized her hands were already trembling. She didn't know it yet, but her next 30 seconds would be the most unforgettable and most dangerous of her short career. The tray was warm against her arm, the smell of fried chicken curling upward in waves. She'd balanced heavier loads before, but tonight her grip felt weaker, her fingertips numb. She kept her eyes on the booth, counting the steps, 7 tiles from the kitchen to Elvis's table. Halfway there, a voice cut across. The diner. Mary, it was the cook, calling from behind her. She turned her head just enough to answer a mistake. Her elbow shifted, the tray tilted. In one sickening moment, the plate of chicken slid forward. The mashed potatoes followed, heavy, with thick brown gravy. The first splash hit her forearm, hot enough to make her flinch. And then the plate was gone. It landed with a dull thud in Elvis's lap. Gasps shot through the diner like a wave. A man at the counter muttered something under his breath. The jukebox, oblivious, kept playing a cheerful tune, the contrast almost cruel. Her throat went dry. Oh my God, I'm so... She grabbed at the nearest stack of napkins, her hands shaking so hard they rattled. Elvis looked down. The gravy was soaking into his jacket, dripping toward his white trousers. She expected the flash of irritation, the kind of sharp look she'd seen from impatient customers before. Instead, he stayed still, like he was processing what had just happened. She pressed the napkins forward. I'm so sorry, sir, I didn't. Her voice broke. From somewhere in the room, a whisper floated. He's gonna be mad. Every eye was locked on that corner booth. Forks hovered in mid-air. Even the cook had leaned halfway out the kitchen door. Mary wished she could vanish. She thought about bolting to the back room, maybe out the side exit, never coming back. Her cheeks burned so hot she could feel the tears threatening. But before she could move, Elvis's hand came up, not fast but steady. His fingers lightly touched her wrist. He didn't say a word. Not yet. The moment stretched, silent except for the record spinning on the jukebox. In that pause, Mary's heart pounded so loud she was sure he could hear it, and then the smallest twitch at the corner of his mouth. A smile. She wasn't sure, but she would find out in the next breath, because instead of anger, what came out of his mouth would make the entire diner exhale at once. For a moment, the diner felt like it had slipped. Underwater, no clinking plates, no hum from the counter chatter, just the low, steady spin of the jukebox. Elvis's sunglasses slid down his nose, just enough for Mary to see his eyes. They weren't sharp or impatient. If anything, they looked calm. He still had one hand lightly holding her wrist, not tight, not pulling, just enough to stop her frantic napkin attack. His fingers were warm, steadying hers like he'd done this before with someone nervous. From the counter, a man in a worn ball cap leaned toward his friend and whispered, "He's smiling." Mary blinked, unsure if she believed it. Elvis let go of her wrist, reached down, and carefully set the soaked napkin on the table. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, he stood up. The gravy stain was spreading across the front of his jacket, but he didn't even look at it. Instead, he looked around the diner, every booth, every stool, like he was taking the room in. "Honey," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "that's the best thing that's happened to me all week." A burst of laughter rippled through the room. It wasn't mean, it was relief. The tension broke so completely that even the cook in the doorway grinned. Mary stood frozen, napkin still in hand, her mind racing to catch up. Elvis chuckled and added, "I was starting to think nobody in Memphis remembered how to keep me humble." That got another laugh from a man in the back booth. Mary managed a weak smile. I really am sorry, sir." "Darlin'," Elvis said, still smiling, "if a little gravy is the worst thing that happens to me today, I'm a lucky man." He sat back down, adjusting himself in the booth like nothing had happened. The men with him gave quick nods to the staff, and one even joked, "Guess we'll skip dessert tonight." Mary felt her shoulders loosen for the first time since she'd stepped out of the kitchen. But there was still the mess, the jacket, the booth seat, the ruined plate. She turned to grab a rag when Elvis called after her. "Hold up," he said, "bring me the same thing again. And make sure you're the one to serve it." That last part caught her off guard. Why would he want her to come back after what just happened? Mary nodded slowly, the knot in her chest easing just a little. At the counter, the regular in the ball cap shook his head. "Man's got class," he muttered. Mary didn't realize it then, but the rest of the night wouldn't just be about replacing a meal. Elvis had already decided to turn this accident into something no one in that diner would forget, and the way he did it would make even strangers at other tables feel like they were part of the story. When Mary came back from the kitchen with a fresh plate, Elvis didn't just nod for her to set it down. He grinned and patted the table like he was inviting a friend to sit. "All right," he said, "let's try this again, but this time, no fast turns." A ripple of laughter moved through the booths. Even the truckers at the counter turned to watch. Mary felt her cheeks warm, but now it wasn't from embarrassment. It was from being the center of a very different kind of attention. She set the plate down carefully. Elvis leaned back, eyeing it as though it were a stage prop. "Now that," he said, "looks like it could win awards." He glanced toward the other tables. "Anybody want to take bets? I make it through the meal without wearing it." The laughter grew louder. People who'd been strangers minutes earlier were swapping comments, shaking their heads in amusement. Mary couldn't help it. She laughed too. It came out in a quick burst, surprising her. Elvis caught it, pointed, and said, "See? That's the smile I was looking for." He dug into the chicken, talking between bites to the folks nearby. He asked a couple how long they'd been married. Told the young man at the counter he liked his hat. It was like he'd decided the whole diner was his stage, and every single person in it was part of the act. Halfway through the meal, Elvis reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He pulled out a folded silk scarf, deep blue, with a white stitched border. He turned it over in his hands for a moment, then held it out to Mary. "Here," he said. "Luck travels better when you pass it on." She took it slowly, the fabric cool and smooth between her fingers. I don't know what to say, just keep it," he replied. "And if you ever have another night like tonight, remember, it's just dinner." Mary tucked the scarf into her apron pocket. It wasn't until years later that she'd admit to friends she never once wore it. She kept it safe in a box under her bed. At the time, though, she just nodded, feeling something shift. This wasn't about fried chicken anymore. What she didn't know was that the scarf was only the beginning. Elvis wasn't finished turning her worst night into her favorite story. The night was winding down. The last few tables had gone quiet, content to linger in the afterglow of having dinner a few feet from Elvis Presley. Mary was wiping down the counter when she saw him push his plate away and stand. He didn't head straight for the door. Instead, he walked toward her with that unhurried, deliberate stride that made it feel like he had nowhere else to be. The two men with him stayed back, letting him go alone. Mary's hands froze on the rag. Elvis rested one elbow on the counter, leaned in slightly, and lowered his voice. "You kept serving with a smile," he said. "That's rare. Don't lose it." Up close, his voice was softer than she expected, almost a whisper, but steady. There was no performance now, no crowd-watching grin, just a direct kindness that made her feel like the only person in the room. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few bills. Instead of handing them over, he slipped them into the glass-tip jar beside the register. The bills folded into the others so neatly she didn't see how many there were. "Thank you, darling," he said, straightening Dot. Mary managed a quiet, "Thank you, Mr. Presley." Though her throat felt tight, he gave a small nod, put his sunglasses back on, and walked to the door. The bell jingled again as he left, the warm night air drifting in for just a moment. It wasn't until she'd watched him climb into a waiting car and pull away that she looked back at the tip jar. The glass was smudged with fingerprints, the money inside still shifting from where he'd pressed it down. Her breath caught. There was more than a week's pay in there. She glanced toward the kitchen, where the cook was stacking pans, oblivious. The owner's wife was sweeping in the corner, humming to herself. No one else seemed to notice. Mary reached for the scarf in her apron pocket and held it for a second, the silk cool against her palm. She wasn't sure which gesture meant more, the money or the fact that he'd taken the time to speak to her directly when he could have just left. She closed the register for the night, still feeling that strange mix of disbelief and gratitude. The next morning, she found something else waiting for her at the diner. Mary arrived for her shift just after 9 a.m., the morning air still heavy with summer heat. She tied her apron in the back room and stepped out into the quiet diner. The smell of fresh coffee lingered, and sunlight slanted through the front windows, pooling across the empty booths. That's when she saw it, a small brown package sitting by the register. Her name was written in thick black marker across the top. She frowned. No one ever left her mail here. The owner glanced up from wiping the counter. That came about an hour ago, he said. Guy in a suit dropped it off. Didn't leave a name. Mary untied the thin string and unfolded the brown paper. Inside was a smaller white box. Her hands were already trembling when she lifted the lid. On top was a folded piece of hotel stationery. She recognized the handwriting instantly. Large, looping, confident. You made my night. Ipashi swallowed hard, her eyes blurring for a second. Underneath the note lay a simple gold bracelet. No diamonds, no engraving, just a clean, elegant band that caught the light as she lifted it out. The owner leaned over. Is that? Mary nodded before he could finish. She turned the bracelet in her hands. It wasn't flashy, but it was deliberate, the kind of gift chosen, not just bought. Some people just get an autograph, the owner said quietly. Looks like you got a story. Mary smiled, a small, private smile. She slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. It was cool at first, then warmed quickly against her skin. Years later, according to her family, she still wore it every day. At church, at family dinners, even while gardening. She told the story so many times that her nieces could recite it. Word for word, the spilled plate, the silk scarf, the quiet kindness, and finally, the bracelet. It wasn't about meeting a famous man. It was about the way he made her feel in the moment she expected to be at her lowest. The diner itself didn't change much over the years. The booths stayed red, the jukebox kept playing the same old records. But if you asked the locals, they'd tell you that night, the one where Elvis walked out wearing gravy and left a gold bracelet behind, was part of its history now. She never saw him again. But when anyone asked about the bracelet, she'd touch it lightly and say, he treated me like a person, not a mistake. If this story touched you, share it with someone who believes kindness is worth remembering. What's one moment when a stranger surprised you with grace?